wiping the sleep out of our eyes as we put a wrap on the Canada Day long weekend and a not so good weekend for the Blue Jays in the American League East. Stunning development. We welcome you to episode 9 of Exit Philosophy. I'm Scotty Mac. Griff is here, and you can get all of Griff's work, the full catalog, multiple baseball columns weekly, a weekly MLB Power Rankings, exclusive conversations with ex-Blue Jays and Expos. Moises Alou, Darren Fletcher are two names that come to mind. And you can get the Exit Philosophy podcast all at griffsthepitch.com. griffsthepitch.com. And Griff, I don't expect kudos from your son, Pat, because I simply did my job, but he will at the very least be proud that we got griffsthepitch.com in the first couple of minutes of this podcast, because usually I'm brain dead and I forget, but today I wrote it down.
Perfect. There's a lot that infuriates him about me, but I like to share that with you when you forget. That's always good. Scotty, last week you were doing Exit Philosophy on your deathbed, it seemed. You seem to be much better now. And also we talked about your friend and my friend, Ricky Romero, and apparently he did something terrific.
Oh,
the team that you're affiliated with in a distant way.
Yes. So I'm through the vid, through COVID.
Perfect.
Thankfully. So that was definitely an experience. I won't say much about it because if you're listening, you've probably had it, or if you haven't, you know somebody who has. Most of the time when you get sick, at least in my experience, the changes happen while you're asleep, right? Like you go to bed one night, you feel okay. The next morning, the cold set in, or the cough, or like the fever. With COVID, all of the different changes happened while I was awake. So it was 2 weeks ago tonight, because we're sitting here on Monday morning, July the 3rd. It was 2 weeks ago tonight that I'm sitting there, I'm streaming some Netflix show, and it's like I got flattened by a Mack truck, just drove through the living room and pancaked me. And the fever lasted for 2 days, but Wednesday afternoon, a couple weeks ago, the fever broke, but I had the sore throat and the cough. Then 2 days after that, while I was awake on the Friday, the sore throat broke. And it's just been a lingering cough now. I've long been testing negative. So
perfect.
I'm through that. I guess I can contribute now to the herd immunity. Is that even a thing? I mean, God knows where we are. But I want to.
Yeah, what about the Ricky thing?
Yeah, I do want to shout out Ricky. So my very good friend, Derek Churchill-Smith, and I have been pals since we were in diapers. And before you cut the joke, oh, you mean last week? Like we've been friends for more than 40 years.
For me, it's next week.
Yeah. Shout out to Toronto Mike and his sponsor, Ridley Funeral Home. We're booking our plots, right? But Derek and I have been pals since the early 80s when we were toddlers and grew up together and have stayed in good touch. Derek's got 3 kids, and his oldest is 13-year-old Hunter, who's a pretty good ball player, plays for the Etobicoke Rangers. And had the opportunity to go watch him pitch in a tournament game in mid-May. And out of that, Derek and I, you know, we sat beside each other the whole game and whatever. Out of that came some conversations, and we're like, well, you know, Ricky and I are pals because we're both diehard 49ers fans. So we stay in touch. We text religiously for 3 hours every Sunday in the fall, trying to emotionally help each other through 49ers games. And out of that has come a bit of a friendship that's lasted. And this idea was spawned, hey, you know, like maybe Ricky, because Ricky's wife, Kara, great soccer player, now retired. She's from the area and her family is still here. And so they come and spend part of the summer in the GTA. And, you know, Ricky does some stuff for Sportsnet and with the Blue Jays. So I got Ricky's dates and for coming to town, and I ran it by him. I said, you know, my very good friend has a son who's a very good ball player, and at 13 they're just getting to that competitive age. Would you mind coming in and helping run a practice? The coaches would love it. And Ricky, who just got through coaching his oldest son, who's 7, for the first time, got done coaching a baseball season down in Hermosa Beach, didn't just say yes. Like, he was like, absolutely, I'd love to. So this particular team, the Etobicoke Rangers, has a deep association with Denny Birdie and Pro Teach Baseball in South Etobicoke. And it was good because it was raining that night that we were indoors. And Ricky came, and the head coach of the team, Adam Verderman, said, look, Ricky, you got the run of the place. They broke the kids into 3 groups, hitting in the cage, taking some infield, and all the pitchers throwing sides. And Ricky kind of looked at Adam and said, there's only one place for me, and that's on or by the mound. And Ricky paid attention to each kid that threw a side session and helped to refine some of their deliveries and repeat their deliveries a little better. And we did a brief introduction before the entire practice, and then we did a 35 to 40 minute Q&A with the kids after the practice, and he gave more than 2 hours of his time. And I want to shout Ricky out. I mean, I'm biased because he's a friend. But Ricky's a really good dude who just wants to give back. And it's awesome that he took the time that he did. And I know the kids really, really appreciated it.
Yeah, that's tremendous. And I really get a kick out of having followed Ricky's coaching career with his own son and those kids, just the emotion that you can feel through Twitter and through Facebook. And the fact that he cares so much, and clearly that continued on to even outside of his own family to helping kids in the area, which is tremendous. I saw when the Jays on Saturday on July 1st had the citizenship ceremony, which I'll have you know, I think there were 10 first pitches, and it made mine look really good. They were in the dirt over there.
Yeah.
But Ricky's response to that was, can I be a part of that next year? Which I thought was, a nice way of saying that how much he enjoys the country, being around, and his experience with the Blue Jays and with the city. I mean, his wife, as you said, is from the area, so that's a head start to wanting to be a part of that ceremony. So that's great to hear. But now we got to get down to the nitty gritty, and I know that you have some strong opinions on the Blue Jays and where they stand as Canada Day heads towards Labor Day, and they're laboring badly. So yeah, let's start with that. Let's start with the current Blue Jays and what their hopes are. I have some opinions, but you can start.
Can we just agree? And I don't know if I'm talking to you, Griff. I am in part talking to you, but I'm also talking to you who's listening or watching on YouTube at youtube.com/exit philosophy.
There you go.
Putting it all together. That this team is exactly what it is. This team is not very good, and this team is not very bad. This team, in an expanded playoff format, is a team that could sneak in, and then we all understand anything could happen. They have a very good starting rotation. They're getting plus seasons of some description from 4 of their starters: Kevin Gausman at the top of the list, Jose Barrios and Chris Bassett beneath Gausman, and then Yusei Kikuchi, who's been pretty good lately, especially pulling up the rear of those 4. So they have a pretty good starting rotation. I would add that they need to add an arm, either via trade or hope that the Hyunjin Ryus of the world and the Alek Manoahs of the world come in and contribute. The bullpen is all right. Eric Swanson had a tough weekend against Boston, but has had a generally very good year. Jordan Romano, I've expressed my hesitations, but he's the league leader in saves, so I can't argue that stat. Tim Mays has been very good. Otherwise, it's been, and Trevor Richards, otherwise it's been rickety. For me, the lineup: George Springer's been very good for 2 months. Bo Bichette, I'm going to say, has been very good all season. You're allowed to slump relative to your elite statistics over 162 games without being criticized for it. He's been very good all season. Whit Merrifield's an all-star, 340 on base, essentially, had a pretty good year. And then you've got Vladdy, who's hit and miss, Brandon Belt, who's hit and miss, Kevin Kiermaier, who's exceeded expectations, but I think is a bottom-of-the-order hitter, so kind of falls into that hit and miss category. This offensive batting lineup is 3.5 hitters deep on any given day. Any given day. This lineup doesn't scare me. This team doesn't scare me. This team doesn't run the bases very smartly. Apparently, nobody got the scouting report on Alex Verdugo more than once this weekend. And those issues have permeated all season long on the base paths. At some point, Griff, they are what they are. And this is what they are. Might sneak in the back part of the playoff bracket, finish above 500 with probably 86 to 89 wins. And that's it. That's it. Yeah. Whatever reputation they entered the season with or that we anticipated, I think we now need to adjust that because this team is what we have seen over more than half a season.
Yeah, I agree with some of that, maybe a lot of that. But, a 4-man lineup that scares you, that's other than the Texas Rangers, I would say that that's about the norm in today's American League. Even the Yankees, you look at their lineup when you get to Yankee Stadium or they come to Rogers Center, you look at their lineup and you go, where are all these guys that you're supposed to be scared of? And I know that Judge is out, and when he comes back, that changes it. Tampa Bay, same thing. You got a bunch of pedestrian hitters in there. But we see the Blue Jays every day, and we see Bo as the only one who is performing up to what is expected. We see Vlad nowhere near what he was at his prime, and his prime at 22 years old, you expect that he'll be able to carry that or improve on that. And improving on that would make that a scary lineup. But he hasn't done that. You haven't had a guy with the Blue Jays who has stepped up in a series, in a 3-game series, maybe like Verdugo did. And Verdugo is not he's not even an all-star. But you haven't had one of the Jays step up and win 2 of the 3 games with his bat and just be cocky and arrogant as he takes that victory away from the other team. And you don't have that. And the Blue Jays need that. And to keep comparing this Blue Jays team with what happened in 2015 and say, well, at the trade deadline, they were a game under 500 or a game above. And all of a sudden they turned it on and won so many games down the stretch and went deep into the postseason. Well, that's not well and good, but there's no indication that the Blue Jays at the trade deadline are going to be getting a David Price, getting a Lowe that they got from Seattle, getting a Ben Revere to strengthen the lineup. There's no indication that these things will be happening for this Blue Jays team. And you mentioned if Alek Manoah comes back and if Hyun-Jin Ryu comes back and adds to the rotation, one of those 2 guys added to the 4 men already there, or maybe in my opinion, they should have both those guys in there. So 6-man rotation for a while, but that's only if they prove that they can be effective in that role. Otherwise, you might as well roll with Trevor Richards as an opener and get your 3 innings out of him if all you're going to get out of Ryu is 3 innings.
Yeah, well, I think you hit the nail on the head of it. And I have not seen the comparisons to 2015. But I suppose they're fair because the record is in the same neighborhood.
That's the main comparison.
Yeah, the Jays were 51-50 after 101 games, right? And they got back from that West Coast trip, and Bo Schultz had just thrown a dreadful cutter that got destroyed for, I forget who hit it. It was a left-handed hitter. Was it Kyle Seager or somebody? 3-run homer. It turned a lead into a deficit, and the Jays got run out of Seattle. But Alex Anthopoulos looked at the run differential and decided to go all in. And to your point about you don't see a David Price on the horizon or even a Mark Lowe. Well, Mark Shapiro lectured Alex Anthopoulos after he was hired. Shapiro lectured Alex Anthopoulos about those trades. Wasn't a fan of them. Now, here's the interesting thing about prospects, Griff, is if you go back and look at all of those trades from the 2015 deadline, who made it? Matt Boyd had a couple of decent years for the Tigers. Daniel Norris had health issues and different things, but never made it. Jeff Hoffman, who went to...
I think he's in Cincinnati now, isn't he?
Who went to Colorado in the Tulowitzki trade, like that, he didn't make it. But Mark Shapiro, amid telling Alex Anthopoulos, I'd like you to stay with the Blue Jays so I can help teach you to be a better general manager. And I'm paraphrasing there, but that is essentially the quote. Indicates through those sorts of conversations that they're just not necessarily going to be all that bold, to say nothing of the fact that entering this season, they had the 20th ranked farm system per MLB.com. And so there's nobody knocking on the door. So I'm looking at this, Griff, and look, the Jays are a playoff contending team in an expanded format. I'm not denying that. But when I look at a lineup that I argue is 3.5 hitters deep, the names can change on any given day, but is 3.5 hitters deep, night in, night out. You got a pretty good starting rotation, although you haven't developed any of those pitchers other than Alek Manoah, and we know he's hit a bump here. I don't see the next wave of prospects coming. So now I have questions about player development, because who not named Vladdy or Bo is playing for this team that was developed by this team? Jansen and Kirk, okay, they're a pretty decent catching tandem, and offense isn't necessarily a priority from that position, although the Jays would like a little more of it based on both players' reputations, particularly Kirk from last year. But I don't see a lot of internal development bearing fruit here. Well, so when I look at the now and I look at the future, what we're just going to continue to add via free agency, that's a dangerous game too, because you end up overpaying, and sometimes you pay for guys' pasts rather than their primes or their futures.
Yeah, the thing about this this Blue Jays farm system too is you can't start trading away. You said that it's not very deep in prospects, and I assume that you meant to duplicate what happened in 2015, where you trade prospects for the current. And we've discussed it in,
or even guys who can come up and help, Griff.
Right, but we've discussed in terms of the future of this organization that they cannot and will not ever go into a rebuild with the amount of money, the $360 million or whatever it is that they're spending on renovating Rogers Center. They won't do it because they need the high rollers who aren't your strongest baseball fans, but have the money. They need them to stay interested in this ball club. So you're not going to go into a rebuild, which means that you have to make sure that you don't trade away prospects that'll be part of this team 3 or 4 years down the road. I mean, they traded away Austin Martin, who they picked in the first round from Vanderbilt, after they saw that he wasn't that great. I think I had a better arm from deep shortstop than he did. So they traded him away for Barrios, and he hasn't done anything. And that was 2 years ago.
He's still. I was checking on him earlier in the week. He's an okay AA player.
Yeah. So they're not going to trade away their top 2 or 3 pitching prospects, which is where they're deeper than position players. And so they need to keep signing, and they did a good job building that rotation with healthy, every 5-day guys who are decent in terms of the production they'll give you. But staying on the field is something that this rotation has over most other contenders in the American League, especially the Yankees, who seem to, as you mentioned in earlier, signing players for their past performance, not their current performance. And the Blue Jays have managed to stay away from that in terms of signing pitchers who can take the ball every 5 days and go out there and give you 6 innings, which is a key to staying in contention for a wild card in the division.
Like Griff, every team has a personality. So just because 2015 came up, 2016 can also be involved in this. And every team has to have its own evolution. So I can't sit here and say that one is better than the other, because if 2023's version of the Blue Jays tried to imitate the personality of the 2015 Blue Jays, we'd all be screaming frauds and all that, because that's not who these guys are, and that's fine. It doesn't make them any less competitive. But when you had Donaldson and Bautista in particular, and I used to say this because you and I covered those teams every single day, I always envisioned that group of players, the bus pulling into the bowels of Fenway Park or wherever they were, and those guys disembarking with bags over their shoulders and both arms up in the air, holding both middle fingers up for everybody to see. MFers, we are here and we are coming to kick your ass. And that was the competitive attitude of that team. I'm not implying that this current group of Blue Jays isn't competitive. It does have some animals on it. Like a Chris Bassett, to me, strikes me as an uber competitive animal in the best way possible. That's a compliment. And I don't need Bo Bichette and Vladimir Guerrero Jr. to be people they are not. But when I look at this group, I see a thin lineup, or a lineup that is thinner than we anticipated. I see questionable base running on what feels like a nightly basis, although I acknowledge I'm probably exaggerating there. And some of that attention to detail stuff, there's something missing. And I talk about reputation teams sometimes, and I should pay a $100 fine every time I mention hockey or a hockey team. But, the Maple Leafs beat the Tampa Bay Lightning in the playoffs this spring, and people were like, well, the Leafs always collapse and the Lightning are always deep into the playoffs. They've won a couple cups. And I'm like, yeah, but the Tampa Bay Lightning's third line is dispersed around the NHL now because they couldn't keep all their guys because of the salary cap, the Andre Palats and the Yanni Gourdes. So the Tampa Bay Lightning have a reputation that they have earned as a highly successful franchise, multiple-time cup winner. But that isn't who they are now, even though we associate the crest on the front of the jersey with that success. They are beatable. This Blue Jays team hasn't accomplished anything in October, but I think in our heads now they're an annual contender, and they got Vlad and they got Bo, these flashy, exciting young players, and therefore they must be a team that is going to go deep into October. And I think we started to assume things and built a reputation for this group that might need to be dialed down a bit. I think this is a high 80s win team. And if that's enough to get them into the playoffs in a wild card spot, great, they'll take their chances. They'll probably be on the road for a best of 3. And if they miss, that's another year of controllable Bo and controllable Vlad out the window.
So, Scotty, take the personality that you talk about with the fingers up from that 2015 team, and now take a personality that we might have seen a little bit last year with Teoscar and Lourdes in the home run jacket and the Barrio at the end of the dugout, and take that away, because that's completely gone now with Teoscar in Seattle and Lourdes as an all-star in Arizona.
All-star, yeah.
What is the personality of this team? I don't think they have one. Even a clubhouse leader like George Springer doesn't know whether he's like fun and dancing George Springer or the senior advisor to young guys like Vlad and Bo. He's got a mixed personality that is very tough to focused that this is the personality of the 2023 Toronto Blue Jays, when you don't even know what his real personality is in terms of leadership. You got Matt Chapman, who's headed for free agency, looking for his numbers, and we're not in his head, but as much for his future as it is for this team's present. And, you know, I think you're right in terms of it's difficult to pin this team down. And when they go into another city, they're not rocking into that city as the Toronto Blue Jays. It's a different feel than last year. It's a different feel than it was in 2015. And they're going to have to figure it out. And for them to figure it out, I think Vlad has to step up and really get closer to his numbers that he had in 2021.
But why would you ever have to throw Vlad a strike?
Well, because the next
who's hitting, like Matt Chapman is hitting. I know you and I talked about this last week. You know, Whit Merrifield is hitting 2, and then Bo's 3, and Vladdy's 4, sometimes against lefties now, and they've got Bo 2, Belt 3, Belt 3, and Belt 3. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm breaking the record here now. Like, oh my God.
But the thing about that,
Vladdy 4 against righties, and that's John Schneider, Griff, trying to extend this lineup out, because Matt Chapman. You don't want Matt Chapman up in a clutch situation right now. And
you do want to be pitching to Matt Chapman instead of Vlad in certain situations. No matter how much Vlad is struggling, you don't want him to be the guy to beat you. So you throw that slider outside, you throw a fastball just off the plate, and if the umpire gives it to you, now you're in Vlad's head and you got him. But if you have Bo hitting behind Vlad, which is what we've suggested on Exit Philosophy since the beginning of the season, you got a guy who doesn't really care if the ball's on or off the plate. He's got a better chance of putting a ball in play and doing damage. Bo, we're talking about. And nobody wants to reach Bo by pitching around Vlad. And to me, that's what needs to be done, because you get into late innings and you forget what the lineup is. You see Bo coming to the plate and you go, okay, well, Vlad's on deck. And then you realize, no, it's Brandon Belt who's on deck. And that is not, to me, the optimum way of constructing that lineup. And, you know, clearly the series against the Red Sox and playing any game against the AL East supports that. I mean, they really need to come up with a different plan, a different lineup. And I don't care about, you know, you can put your top 3 guys at the top of the order. That's what it should be.
Are you arguing Vlad should hit 2?
Yeah.
Okay, because I mean, from everything I've heard, so I assume you've heard it, that's just a no-fly zone for him. Like, he doesn't want to hit 2. Well,
he's certainly struggling hitting 3 and 4. And I think that, I mean, I'm going back to when the team was playing in Buffalo. I was in a coach's room when they were talking, and the majority vote was that Vlad should hit 2nd and Bo would hit 4th. And that was coming out of, you know, back into real baseball. And so that was 2 years ago. That was 2 years ago. Why has it changed? It hasn't changed. It's the same coaching staff. I think that they would have the same opinion on it. And if it's Vlad who's balking at it, then screw Vlad. I mean, put him there, because that makes your team better. That makes your lineup better. That gets Springer, who's becoming George Springer, at the plate again. Vlad and Bo batting 3rd. That puts your best 3 hitters coming up in the 8th and 9th inning when this team has not been responding with big hits.
Yeah, they got to do something. And if you adjust the lineup, Griff, and nothing changes, well, then that tells you that it's a personnel thing.
Yeah, I think we both.
But if you're saying you were in the coach's room, they held a vote to a man on what they think.
was just a
Well,
discussion. Yeah.
okay, but Vladdy's not hitting 2. So
No.
if they hold that opinion, and they arguably still hold that opinion today, and it's not happening, there's a reason for that.
Well, he's being paid nicely to do what the manager and coaches tell him to do. And so just because he doesn't want to do it, have him do it. And that's all there is to it.
Like last year, I was arguing for 6 weeks before they finally pulled the trigger on it. And it coincided with Charlie being sent out and John Schneider ascending to the managerial role, that it was time to move Bo out of the 2-hole. Like, he wasn't, there's no argument this year because Bo's been great. Bo's a guy who's not going to walk a lot, but if he's hitting at the level he has been all season long, where he's going to probably run away with the American League lead, 220, 230 hits when all is said and done, well, he's on base often enough just because he's getting enough hits.
Yeah.
But last year he wasn't, and it took forever to make the adjustment. Now, Bo ended up back hitting 2 because he got hot late in the season and he was in fuego and you wanted him there. It wasn't like this has to be permanent. It's just he's not, you can't have your 2-hitter with a sub 300 on base percentage for 3 months like the Blue Jays did last year.
Yeah.
Bo is full value for being an upper third of the lineup guy now. I think you need Vladdy seeing better pitches, and different people have different perspectives on protection and what have you. But if you've got Bo hitting behind Vladdy, that pitcher knows he can't pitch around Vlad, because if Vlad's on first, Bo's more likely to drive him in than Matt Chapman.
Most definitely.
Right?
And like when you get to, if you have the top 2 in the order, Springer and Bo, there's a chance that you get to the 3rd spot and you've only made the pitcher throw 3 or 4 pitches because they're both aggressive hitters. Vlad is trying to be more patient. And so having him in the 2, and he's not a plug on the bases either. When he's running the bases, he goes first to third, second to home. He can do that as a number 2 hitter. But I just think that in terms of him seeing better pitches, seeing more pitches, and with Bo, it makes less of a difference whether they're pitching him in the zone, because he can spoil the best pitcher's pitch and then find a pitch that he can drive to right field or pull down the line. Doesn't matter. But I think it's not working. The way it is right now is not working. So why not try something else? Even if the main participant doesn't want to be a participant.
And bigger picture with regard to this front office, for context. This front office has now been here longer than Alex Anthopoulos was general manager, and by the end of this season will have had the same length of tenure as JP Ricciardi. This is how far along we are in this. This is year 8.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the player development complex in Dunedin and the stadium renovations here in Toronto are all wonderful things. This team wins more games than it loses year in and year out now. That's important because it makes you a playoff contender, especially in an expanded playoff format like baseball now has. But there should be some kind of expectation of results. Results when it counts. And this, you never hear anything, probably because Mark Shapiro very effectively manages up with the chairman, and Ross Atkins is here for the duration of Mark Shapiro's time here. Ross Atkins not going to be the general manager of any other big league team. And so at some point there needs to be results in October, and there needs to be an honest auditing of where this franchise is. And I hang on this to the point of annoyance for some people, I know. But my opinion is that this franchise, having not won a playoff game in the era of Shapiro and Atkins with regard to any team that Shapiro and Atkins has built. Okay, 2016, they were new. They did augment the roster, but that was essentially the previous regime's roster. This era of the Blue Jays has yet to win a playoff game, and in my view has been surpassed by the Baltimore Orioles, who are a good team and getting better because their farm system is about to produce even more. And we have got
but they lost for so many years in a row that they
did, and I'm not advocating for that. I'm not but the Blue Jays lost too, Griff.
Not to the point of building up draft inventory that's much higher than what the
first overall picks or second overall picks. I get it. I get it. There was a heavy price to pay in Baltimore, but we are at a point in the Blue Jays trajectory that you would expect there to be a higher number than 0 playoff wins. And I allow for the fact that this team could get in, could win a best of 3 on the road and advance into the playoffs, and Bo and Vladdy could carry them offensively. They've got a good starting rotation. I understand they could go on a run in October. I'm not denying that. I don't see it. I don't see it.
I really believe that that game 2 aberration last year against Seattle, that's a winning game that they played, other than Anthony Bass not being able to get anybody out and loading the bases and then the bullpen imploding. But I think if they had held on to that historical collapse, if they had held on to that game, that they would have won on the Sunday, and then we'd be in a different discussion. But, they didn't. They had lost the 2 games against Tampa in a wild card round during the pandemic 2020 season. So it's a small sample size. To me, it's a little early to use that as an argument.
Okay, but this is year 8.
Oh, right?
Yeah. You would acknowledge
they had to get rid of, in the first couple of years after winning in 2016 and making the playoffs, they had to tear that team down because of the aging aspect and the salary aspect, and then build it back up. So going back 8 years and saying that this, 2020 and 2022 were the first times is accurate, but it sort of doesn't give them any credit for having to tear down and then build back up, which was their rebuild, their version of a rebuild.
Right. But we're now in the part of the story and the arc where there should be.
Where we pick it up now results. Is where I start agreeing with you that they need to do something starting now. And if Chad Green comes back and plays the part of Lowe, if Ryu comes back and plays the part of a 2020 Hyunjin Ryu, and if Alek Manoah comes back and has learned what his problem was in the lab, in the PDC lab, then they might not have to make all of those moves, but they do need to make at least one significant trade deadline move.
Yeah, I think they need a bat. I think they need an arm in the rotation. And I understand it could be both Manoah and Ryu, and you do the 6-man, but just with Hyunjin Ryu's coming off injury, you can't be sure what you're going to get with Alek Manoah and everything that's happened. You can't be sure what you're going to get. I would argue they need an arm in the rotation. They need an arm in the pen. Is it Chad Green, or is it Chad Green plus an acquisition? And they need a bat. They need a bat.
Yeah, and
they got a lot of work to do.
The disappointment, and I understand that getting rid of Lourdes and Teoscar improved the outfield defense, improved the defense overall, which has led to the pitching staff, the starting pitchers especially, having better numbers and looking better overall, maybe looking like they always should have looked.
Yeah.
But the Dalton Varsho that has been on the field this season offensively is less than what was expected and promised when he came over. And I mean, you have an opinion on that. I have an opinion, like he's got too many holes in his swing right now. When you look back and say, oh, well, he's got 18 bunt hits and still has, not this year, but overall, and most of those against left-handed pitchers. That means his struggle against left-handed pitchers is even more than we had thought, just looking at the bare numbers.
Yeah. Well, he had a sub 600 OPS against lefties last year for Arizona. And I always get concerned when I look at somebody's OPS and I see heavy slug. And his OPS last year, Varsho's, against right-handed pitchers, which is the favorable side for him, given that he's a left-handed hitter, was above 800, but only 317 of that was on base. It was high 400s slug. So if that slug drops and the on base stays about the same or regresses as well, then you're into an area where he's struggling really against anybody.
Well, the one positive, and we can wrap this segment up with this, is that his struggles against left-handed pitching has led Whit Merrifield to the All-Star team, because not only is Whit playing a decent second base, but, second base is a position that they're loaded down with Espinal and Kevin Biggio, but because of Merrifield's ability to play left field as well at a competent basis, he is playing almost every day and has earned a spot on the All-Star team.
Absolutely. Hitting about 290 on base 34% of the time. And if you've been selected by your peers, by the players, that tells you how these guys feel about somebody like Whit Merrifield, right?
You're looking at the All-Star rosters, and what you don't want as a player named to the All-Star team is to be named by the commissioner because your team needed somebody on the roster.
Somebody from the Kansas City Royals has to go, right?
Yeah, you don't want that to happen. But Merrifield surprisingly was selected by the players, and that means that he had to finish first or second, because if the fans and the players select the same person for a position, then it falls to the player who finished second in the player balloting. So that's something that Merrifield has, and I thought he would have been a commissioner's pick, but no, he was a player pick. And that's great for him. And he acknowledged that when he spoke about it. So that's good that, you get some of the MLB picks. Like, surprisingly, Kevin Gausman he's deservedly on the team, but he wasn't a player's pick as a starting pitcher. And so Justin Steele, Devin Williams, Luis Castillo, these are all MLB picks. Luis Castillo is probably one of the best starting pitchers in baseball, stuff-wise. And he had to be named by the commissioner's office. And there's a disappointing team too. Seattle should have way more. They should be better in the standings, and they should have more All-Stars the way they looked like they were building last year, and they don't, especially after they added Castillo.
Yeah, I think we're going off topic here, but I think the three teams that you would look at in baseball as being the most disappointing, in whatever order you want to put them: St. Louis Cardinals, New York Mets, Seattle Mariners.
I'd say San Diego Padres.
San Diego, yes, very good. Yeah, good point. I should not have left them out.
Yeah, no, I too. In order, I'd say the Mets, Padres, and Cardinals, and I think the Cardinals third, only because it's become apparent how much they miss Yadier Molina and how much they relied on him to guide that pitching staff, and to be what we discussed earlier that the Blue Jays don't have, is a personality that reflects the entire team and you ride as you go through a 162 game season. And that was the Yadier Molina, and there's nobody on the Blue Jays currently who fills that role.
Right. So Merrifield, Bo's an obvious all-star. We know he didn't win the voting because it's the Texas Rangers against the National League, at least when the All-Star game starts.
Yeah.
wow, the Texas Rangers are all of a sudden good, right? And Marcus Semien and Corey Seager will be the middle of the infield. Jonah Heim got a start too.
Yeah,
right?
Good Buffalo kid. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think Josh Young is going, the third baseman,
that's a surprise
as well.
Sure. Yeah,
yeah. So I don't know. Maybe they just were ballot stuffing in Arlington, or going online and doing it. Vladdy makes it. Yeah, Vladdy makes it, but not as the starter because Yandy Diaz gets voted in, and Yandy Diaz leads the American League in both batting average and on base. And the Tampa Bay Rays have some guys hitting home runs. Like Yandy's got 16. Jose Siri's got 15 or so, right? Like they've scored more than 100 runs, 100 more runs than the Blue Jays. Like this, you look at their lineup and you're like, so where's it all coming from?
Yeah.
They score runs left, right, and center, though. But Yandy Diaz, so we're talking, Griff, before, and like, who the hell would have voted for him?
Yeah.
Are Rays fans who don't go to the games?
Yeah, not fans in the stands, that's for
sitting at home, being like, we got to get Yandy there.
That is a head scratcher right there. And like a team that is as good as the Rays are, with as few fans in the stands as the Rays have, with as few baseball fans in the state of Florida. Like there's a whole country voting for, which leads me to another point. There's a whole country voting for Blue Jays. And Jose Bautista said he had two countries voting for him. He had the Dominican and Canada. And I think that Major League Baseball has screwed Toronto Blue Jays players by changing the rules for that last 5-day segment or 4-day segment where you were only allowed to vote once. What kind of a democracy is this where you can only vote once?
If you want to be that person sitting at your computer for 4 hours, you should be allowed to.
But in the past, when they first came up with the variation of voting for all-star teams, they didn't realize that Canadians love online voting. And like, this is a direct slap in the face of Canadians and Toronto Blue Jays fans, is that now you're only allowed to vote once. And that's why there were 5 Blue Jays in the final balloting, and none of them won, because it was cut down to 1 vote for 5 days and 1 vote every 24 hours. That was it. And that levels the playing field and takes Blue Jays players out of the mix as being starting players in the All-Star game. And
Griff, nobody's really, it's like an election, right? Nobody's really paying attention until the final week.
Right.
And then you lock in and it's, I can only do this once.
Yeah. That's crazy. I mean, I would say that Bo is really the only one who deserved to be a starting All-Star, and he definitely deserved it, and he didn't make it. So, but it's always was interesting and brought a smile to see undeserving Blue Jays on the All-Star team. But yeah, they changed the rules, and now they've screwed all the fans across Canada. Good for baseball.
I love that stadium. We as we say, Safeco. It's T-Mobile Park now in Seattle, but that's hosting the All-Star game. That's always been one of the great stops, and we're biased too because of the environment that Western Canadians create coming down and cheering for the Blue Jays. But even without that, Griff, that is a gorgeous ballpark, and the assault on your nostrils sitting in that open air press box with the garlic fries cooking on the main floor, in the main floor concessions, and it wafts up. And for the entire game, I'd be writing, and we'd be watching the game and scoring and doing all the things we do. And the garlic fries, heaven.
Also in that ballpark at that last All-Star game that they had, brought me one of my favorite moments in All-Star game history, is when they asked Tommy Lasorda to coach third as a guest for 1 inning, and he took a bat that staggered him backwards, and he fell on his fat ass, and his legs were flying up in the air. That was my favorite All-Star moment, because I think that Tommy Lasorda was a despicable human being, but that's just me.
Well, I don't know if it's just you.
Oh, okay.
I think there was sort of a prevailing opinion about Tommy that may have been understated by a lot of people, but yeah.
He's a Hall of Famer.
So I remember that there's a famous photo and obviously the video to go with it, but I had forgotten that happened at the All-Star game in Seattle.
Beautiful. I was just like, brought me out of my seat.
Yeah. Yeah. Safeco, T-Mobile, awesome park. Awesome park. We did an episode of the baseball.
Yeah.
We did an episode of the baseball podcast, our highly promoted previous venture 7 or 8 years ago. Gregor Chisholm was our co-host on that podcast. And so if you were watching a game at T-Mobile, you see Edgar's, the banner on the left field facade. And that there's a bar underneath there named after Edgar Martinez, the great Mariner. And we sat at one of the high top tables and did an episode of the baseball podcast way back in the day. I'd like to say, Griff, available in the archives, but I think that audio, is long gone.
Hey, Scotty, what's your opinion? And it's grown on me, but what's your opinion of the home run derby and the way it has become almost as big as the game on Tuesday night, the home run derby on Monday night? Well, what's your opinion on that?
I mean, I liked some of the format changes that they've made. My challenge with it is that I just can't sit there for 2.5 hours and watch the same thing happen over and over and over and over and over and over again. So I find that I'm into it at the start, and then inevitably my attention starts to wane, and then I change the channel, or I get streaming a show or whatever. So I'm highly unlikely to stay with it start to finish, but I do enjoy the spectacle. I do think it's fun to see the players and their kids running around and sort of that whole environment, but I can't do it for 2.5 hours.
To me, the thing that makes it most appealing, and I must say that I watched the 2019 Derby where Vlad hit 91 home runs off John Schneider and lost to Pete Alonso. But I was fascinated and riveted by that. And so I've watched it pretty closely ever since. And this year with J-Rod and Pete Alonso and Vlad, Mookie Betts and Rosarena, I think they need one more. I'm not sure who that might be. But it seems to me that it will be a pretty good derby again. And when it was announced, I think I let you know when it was announced.
Are you gonna tell the story?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. This I'm gonna shut right up. Go ahead. This is great.
In John Schneider's office, they were talking about it. It hadn't been officially announced yet that Vlad was participating, and then somebody in the media pregame asked Schneider if he was going to pitch, because he pitched and gave up 91 home runs last time. And Schneider said, "Oh yeah, I'm going to go. I'm the manager this time, but I'm going to go." And I thought about it, and so there was a pause, and I said, "Oh, so it came down to you and Kikuchi?" and I haven't seen Schneider laugh. That if he was drinking coffee, it would have been a spit take at that point. But I think everybody got the general drift as our man Kikuchi, who's having a very good year. But
yes, but he will give up his share of home runs. But you got to see the additional context to this, Griff, and I don't have a prime example off the top of my head, but that's you in those office chats. You always would, you'd ask your questions and just sort of be there, but then there was always there was always a line, and Gibby'd be leaning back in his chair, and you'd pop one out there, and Gibby would lose his shit. But that's a classic Griff line right there. Oh, it came down to you and Kikuchi.
Yeah. The Fregosi always noticed the questions. As you point out, I mean, I would ask the legit questions that I needed, and then I would phrase a question in a way just to almost shut down the whole event. but it would always make the manager sort of smile wryly because he shouldn't be smiling. But it was, yeah, I love those office sessions.
Well, just to explain what we're talking about, I don't know if they still do it at 4:00, but that's typically when it was at 4:00 for a 7:00 game. The media who had been hanging around the clubhouse waiting to speak to whoever it was they wanted to speak to, because back then it was Aaron Loop sitting at his locker and everybody else hiding out for a half hour from 3:30 to 4.
Absolutely.
God love Aaron Loop, but you can't ask him a question every single day. We'd go into the manager's office for the writers pregame with the manager. So no cameras, but you could have your recorder out and all that, so you could record the quotes.
And no tweeting either.
No tweeting. But I always remember John Gibbons. So this thing would have a life of 7 to 10 minutes. Sometimes it'd go a little longer, but Gibby knew exactly how to shut the thing down. Gibby would inevitably bring up something political and direct it at Larry Milson, right? Like, Larry, Toronto's got all these bike lanes. And that would get, Gibby didn't have a particular opinion on bike lanes or anything, but he knew how to get under Larry's skin. And then Larry would respond for a while. And by a while, I mean a while. And it would just sort of end the whole thing. Yeah. Everybody ended up laughing and stuff, but it's like, okay, we know it's over because Gibby and Larry are in a political discussion.
At that point, Jay Stenhouse or Mal would just shut it down. This isn't good.
Everybody out. It's BP. It's batting practice time. Out onto the field. Classic. But lots of laughs in those offices, and I always found, Griff, too, that a few times a year, especially if you were one of the ones who traveled all the time, those things would wrap up, and you might get 10 to 15 minutes one-on-one with Gibby. Yeah. Or in this case, John Schneider, nowadays, Charlie Montoya, whoever. Like, you just sort of hang around and be the last to leave. But then as you're walking out the door, the second to last person is left, and you turn around and just sort of lean in and say, hey, and it didn't always have to be about baseball. It was just kind of a get to know you deal, right?
And the thing that people don't understand who haven't been in that environment is that the fact of a camera changes the entire field and the entire demeanor of whoever's being asked a question. It's not just managers, it's players. So you could be having a conversation with a player or manager, and then somebody comes along with a camera, a television camera, and starts an interview, and the whole thing changes. It becomes, should I be saying this? Should I not be saying this?
What's the look on my face?
Yeah. And that's why the informal sessions before a game, which have been going on since I can remember, are so important to the beat writers, to the print media, and even the electronic media who don't have a camera there, and they experience what we see every day in terms of what that camera means to their interview. It changes everything. And if TV wasn't so necessary, I'd say to hell with all of them. But we can't, and we won't.
We missed our time then, eh? We weren't around to cover baseball in 1916.
Oh yeah, me and Red Foley or Damon Runyon or one of those guys. Yeah, I might be old enough to almost remember that stuff.
Could you imagine? Could you imagine being on the road back then, where you're making the same money as the players? The newspaper's paying you. The players they've got jobs back home in the winter. They're just grinding it out. You're ending up at the same pubs and same bars.
Yeah.
After the game, every night you're on equal footing.
You're taking a train to St. Louis.
Oh, God. Yeah.
and Babe Ruth is hanging the manager off the back of the train by his ankles because he's drunk, and you don't write about it. That would be tremendous.
The sanctuary of the clubhouse, right? The train,
Yep.
the train cars, sanctuary of the clubhouse. The 1981 All-Star Game. So we always try to do a Griff's Riffs, and it usually involves one of your stories in a period of time from your 2 decades plus working for the Expos. The 1981 All-Star Game, Griff, was different because there was a players' strike that wiped out about 7 weeks of the season in the middle of summer. And people who remember would know that if you won your division in the first half, you made the playoffs to play the division winner in the second half, and there was like an additional playoff round and all that. But it obviously had an effect too, this players' strike in 1981 on the All-Star Game that year.
Yeah, in fact, when the strike hit, I think it was around June 10th, and they didn't have any format for coming back. They didn't know whether they would ever come back in the 81 season. So the All-Star Game was obviously in jeopardy. And even when the strike was about to be settled, they didn't know what they were going to do with the All-Star Game. It was in Cleveland at the old stadium, which had a huge capacity and should have been condemned long before that.
It was the mistake by the lake, right?
Yeah,
Municipal
clearly.
Stadium. Before Exhibition Stadium got tagged with that nickname.
Yeah. So they didn't know anything about the All-Star Game. All the players were at home. And then the news came that the season would start. So all of the teams except the Expos chose to bring their players to their home city and work out at their major league ballpark at their home stadium, except the Expos, who went down to Florida and used the spring training facility in West Palm Beach at the time, because I think it's had something to do with getting everybody into Canada for that period of time, and just the timing of the whole thing. Plus the facilities allowed for more work to be done, more than just one Olympic Stadium. I mean, who wants to work out at Olympic Stadium to get ready for the season? Anyway, they finally decided that the All-Star Game would be played the day before the season resumed. So the season resumed on Monday, August 10th. The game was going to be played August 9th. So the Expos were at spring training, working out at the facility that they shared with the Atlanta Braves. And Bill Lee had gone home with his wife and 2 kids to Bellingham, Washington. And Bill was a lot different than any other player, not just a little different, a lot different. And he said he was retiring because he was tired of Major League Baseball, who would find him for the marijuana thing in a couple of years earlier, 4 years or 3 years earlier when he had joined the Expos. So he said he was retiring. He was done. And so the Expos needed him because he was one of their prime left-handed pitchers. And so I suggested to John McHale, because they were going to play an exhibition game at Fenway Park against the Red Sox, the only game played during the strike before the season started again, and suggested call Bill and tell him that he can be the starting pitcher at Fenway Park, where he is considered a giant intellectual because of all the colleges and stuff in Boston. And it's sort of phony baloney in a way. They're not that smart. They're not smarter than anybody else. But Bill loved them as an audience for his shtick. And so the next day he flew to West Palm Beach and said, I'm back. I'm ready to go. I'm starting that game in Fenway. So that was a brilliant move, because the Expos went on to win the second half with Bill Lee, in fact, being the winning pitcher in the clinching game at Shea Stadium on October the 3rd. But after Fenway, they went back to Montreal to get ready for the August 10th game. And Charles Bronfman allowed the Seagram's jet to fly Gary Carter, Tim Raines, and Andre Dawson down to Cleveland. Not that long a flight, but Gary Carter hit 2 home runs in that game, was the MVP. I think that's one of the reasons that he had so much backing when it came time to voting him for the Hall of Fame, because he came out of that strike with 2 runs at the All-Star game. The next day they opened the season at Olympic Stadium and won the second half. Steve Rogers then went on to win games 1 and 5 against Steve Carlton in the division series. And then came Blue Monday, Rick Monday's home run in the league championship series. It's funny how in Montreal, the only 2 times they really threatened to go to the World Series was 81 with a strike, 94 with a strike. And so strike 3 was moving to Washington.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my Griff's riff for today.
Awesome stuff. And Steve Rogers, you made that point. We were talking about this before we hit record, that Steve Rogers beat Steve Carlton twice against the Phillies and then had nothing left, but came in relief in the 9th inning of the deciding game against the Dodgers. And he was going on fumes, right? And that's what he's remembered for. And as you would say, it's not fair.
Yeah, I mean, he shut out the Mets 3-0 the day before the clincher at Shea Stadium. So October 2nd, he threw a 2-hit shutout, complete game against the Mets. The next day, Wallace Johnson tripled in 2 runs, and Bill Lee won in relief. And then he beat Carlton twice in the division series. And all people talk about Steve Rogers is, oh yeah, I remember where I was when you gave up that home run to Rick Monday. Yeah. Come on, the guy was the Dave Stieb of Montreal. He was comparable in so many ways, including the timing of his career, and deserves to be remembered for a lot more than that.
Do the Expos beat the Yankees in the '81 World Series if you guys had beaten the Dodgers?
As we say, you get your foot in the door, anything can happen. But I think it would have been difficult. I think the Yankees probably would have won that series because the Expos hadn't been anywhere close in terms of the postseason. But in '94, I think that team, and I've had that argument with Steve Rogers, among others, '81, '94. I think the '94 team had a better chance of going to the World Series and winning the World Series. But '81, it would have been so much fun to at least get there and see what would have happened. But I think the Yankees might have taken the series.
Well, the Blue Jays, Griff, have 6 games between the time we're sitting here on Monday, July the 3rd, and the All-Star break. All of them are on the road, and all of them are against teams they should beat. They should emerge over the next week with a couple of series won. And going 5-1 or 6-0 would be really, really helpful. But 4-2, I would argue, is the minimum. You got 3 against the White Sox, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in Chicago, and then a weekend series Friday, Saturday, Sunday in Detroit, which is always well attended. People cross the border, so there should be a good contingent of Blue Jays fans at that series at Comerica Park. Jays have to have a good week.
I got 2 more things before we get out of here. One of them is to follow up on what you just mentioned, and something that should provide a positive feel going into the post All-Star break is that, people talk about strength of schedule, and we've spoken about it a lot. And the Blue Jays are 31-25 this year. So that's 56 games, 31-25 against teams with a winning record. And that includes their struggles within the AL East. So 31-25, and then 14-15 against teams with a 500 record or below. That's only 29 games out of 85 or whatever they've played. So they've played 29 against 500 or below, 56 against teams with an above 500 record. And they just need to start winning the games that are being presented to them against losing teams, against teams like they're going to play this week, the White Sox and the Tigers. They need to win those games and not make any apologies about it, because they have had a very tough schedule, but they haven't shown any inclination to be winning those games. And that's why it's such an interesting week and such an important week for the Blue Jays moving forward. The other thing I wanted to mention was Alek Manoah and his debacle at the Complex League, and his good start in New Hampshire, in Manchester, New Hampshire on Sunday night. I watched highlights of the Sunday night game, and the pitcher or the umpire's strike zone was all over the place. And I'm not sure, especially high in the zone when Manoah was throwing pitches up there. He got some calls at the top of or above the top of the strike zone, and then he got guys swinging at those pitches. So I don't think we should put too much stock into the 5 innings, 10 strikeouts, 1 run, 3 hits that he showed in New Hampshire. I think we need to see more than that. Coming out of the All-Star break, there's a game where a 5th starter is needed before the end of the month, before the trade deadline. We might see him then to see whether they feel they need to make a trade for a starting pitcher at the deadline. But we're not going to see him before that, and I wouldn't put too much stock as a Jays fan into what he did in New Hampshire, because that umpire will never be a major leaguer.
Well, Mike Wilner was down there for the Star, and Shai Davidi was down there for Sportsnet, and the headline of Mike Wilner's piece in the Star online is a quote from Manoah: "I'm ready to be a Tiger." So either he's anticipating a trade to Detroit,
the small T Tiger, probably lowercase Tiger,
or he's feeling good. He talked a lot. The quotes Wilner had in his piece talked a lot about how Manoah, when he got into that pitching lab, Manoah was saying, "Look, I realized how much I'd slowed down through my delivery, so I had to speed that back up." I mean, only time is going to tell, Griff.
Yeah,
right? We've seen Alek Manoah be an elite major league pitcher.
Yes,
and we've seen a shell of a big league pitcher, regardless of what his name is or was.
And we've discussed why that has happened, why he's a shell, and a lot of it that we discussed in previous exit philosophies have been in his head. It has been mental because of circumstances, because of him being the lowest paid starting pitcher on the Blue Jays team, for which he probably was the best starting pitcher in 2022. So there's a lot of that. And if he can get all of that head game straightened out, and the pitching lab, which I believe in at the PDC, and I believe that was the right move, sending him down there rather than sending him to Buffalo or New Hampshire full time. If he can work all that back into being the Alek Manoah of his first 2 years, then, you know, that'll make a change in the second half. But it's kind of hard to count on that, and with the trade deadline looming on August the 2nd. So we'll see. But it's just a warning, to caveat to Blue Jays fans to not put too much importance into the Sunday night pitching line that he had in New Hampshire. Let's just see him do it again, and do it with a major league umpire and major league hitters.
Yeah, in the very same way, not to overreact to that really ugly line that he had in the Complex League early last week.
Yeah,
right? You're working on stuff.
Yeah, I think at the Complex League, it's tough to pitch when your spikes are full of sweat. When your spikes are melting, right.
The rubber is melting,
and you've lost 8 pounds since the opening pitch.
Right. Yeah, they always say, because it used to be the Florida Complex League used to be called the Gulf Coast League, but as Gibby say, the Gulf Roast League, right? Because you're playing at 11 o'clock in the morning on a back field, in the midday Florida sun in June.
Yeah, and
July. Thanks a lot.
The timing is all about, are you ready to pitch? You don't know the names of any of the hitters who are stepping in. You just know that they want to tong you. They want to be able to call home and say, "Hey, Mom, I just took Alek Manoah deep." Right. And that's the difference between, especially when your head is in the wrong place, like Manoah's is. This is the circumstance under which you're expected to perform and to show that you've improved. So sending him to New Hampshire was also a good move. And I think we talked about it. Sending him to New Hampshire was so that there wouldn't be like a convoy of media going to Buffalo and watching him pitch there.
Right.
You know, I don't think that Mike Wilner has ever been called a convoy, but having him and Shy down in New Hampshire is probably the best case scenario for the Blue Jays moving forward.
We'll leave it there for episode 9 of Exit Philosophy. And remember, full catalog of Griff's work, multiple columns each week, an MLB power rankings each week, exclusive conversations, typically with former Blue Jays or former Expos, kind of interview style, but just back and forth like two guys sitting on bar stools shooting the shit. Griff knows them all. And the Exit Philosophy podcast, all at griffsthepitch.com. Blue Jays need to have a good week in Chicago and Detroit. We'll be back in a week to break it all down. Thanks for listening.
Great, Scotty. Thank you.